In the 1980s in Poland, teachers could hit their hands with heavy wooden rulers for messy handwriting. Nurses checked your hair for lice in front of the whole class while you stood in a nervous line. You even had to practice hiding under desks from nuclear bombs, using only a newspaper for protection. This was the strange and strict reality of Polish schools in the 1980s. The blue smock. If you walked into a Polish classroom 40 years ago, you would see a sea of navy blue. Every child had to wear a special apron, called a fartuszek. It was made of a thin fabric that felt like plastic. For girls, it was long like a dress. For boys, it looked more like a short jacket. The state wanted everyone to look the same, so no one felt richer or poorer than their friends. But there was one thing you had to have on your arm. It was a small shield called a tarcza. This felt badge showed the number of your school. Teachers would actually pull on your shield to see if it was sewn on. If you used a safety pin because you were in a hurry, you were in big trouble. A loose shield could mean a bad grade for your behavior. You also had to carry a separate pair of shoes in a cloth bag. These were usually soft sneakers called juniorki. You could not walk into the school with dirty boots from the street. Everyone had to change their shoes as soon as they entered the building. It was the first rule of the day. Rules and rulers. The school day was very different from what we know today. For most of the decade, children had to go to school on Saturdays too. Imagine having only one day off a week. The classrooms were cold and the furniture was heavy. You sat at wooden desks that sometimes had a hole for an old ink bottle. The teachers were very powerful and everyone was a bit afraid of them. If you talked during a lesson, you might get a sharp slap on the hands with a ruler. This was considered normal back then. What happened if you were really bad? You might be sent to sit in the donkey bench. This was a desk at the very back where everyone could see you and laugh. Or you had to stay after school in a punishment called the goat. While your friends were outside playing, you had to sit in a quiet room and copy long texts from a book. You had to write perfectly, or you would have to start all over again. The grading system was also different. A 5 was the best grade you could get, and a 2 meant you failed. There were no 6s or 1s yet. The bitter taste of health. Health class was not about books. It was about things that happened to your body right there in the classroom. Every few months, a nurse would come in with a tray. She had a bottle of yellow gel that tasted like poison. This was for fluoridation. Every child had to put some on a toothbrush and scrub their teeth while the nurse watched. You were not allowed to rinse your mouth for hours. It left a bitter taste that ruined your lunch. But that was not the scariest part of the day. The nurse would also check everyone for lice. You had to stand in a long line, and she would use a small stick to look through your hair. If she found something, she would call out your name loudly. It was very embarrassing to be the kid with lice. Then there was the milk. Every morning in the winter, the school gave out big cups of warm milk. It was supposed to be healthy, but it often had a thick skin on top. Most kids hated the smell and the feeling of that skin. If you did not drink it, the teacher might get angry, prepared for the end. The 1980s were a time when people were worried about big wars. Because of this, every student had to take a class called civil defense. You learned how to handle a real gas mask. These masks were made of thick grey rubber and had a long hose that looked like a trunk. Everyone called them the elephant. You had to practice putting the mask on in just a few seconds. The rubber smelled like old tires, and it was very hard to breathe inside. It felt like you were underwater. Sometimes the school would have a drill for a nuclear bomb. The alarm would scream through the hallways, and you had to act fast. You were told to fall on the floor and hide under your desk. The teachers told you to cover your head with a white sheet, or even just a newspaper. They said the white color would reflect the heat of the explosion. Even as a child, you might have wondered if a thin piece of paper could really protect you from a bomb. But you did not ask questions. You just stayed quiet on the cold floor and waited for the bell to ring. Silent history. In history class, the books did not always tell the whole story. The government was very strict about what you could learn. They wanted everyone to think the Soviet Union was Poland's best friend. Because of this, many important events were left out of the books. Teachers called these missing stories white spots. You would learn one version of history at school, but when you went home, your parents might tell you something completely different. They would whisper about things that happened in the past that the government wanted to forget. Learning Russian was also mandatory for every child. You had to learn the alphabet and how to speak the language of the Soviet Union. Many students did not like these lessons and would only do the bare minimum to pass. But if you wanted to go to a good college, you had to be good at it. At the same time, religious classes were banned from schools. If you wanted to learn about God, you had to go to a church after your regular classes were over. This created two different worlds for Polish children. One world was for the government, and the other was for their families and their faith. The Great Potato Hunt. Sometimes, the whole school would be sent to a park to rake leaves or plant trees. But the biggest event of the year was the potato harvest. This was known as Wykopki. Instead of going to class, you would get on a big bus and travel to a state farm. You would spend the whole day in a muddy field, picking up potatoes and putting them into heavy bags. Imagine you spent your school day working on a farm. It was hard work, and your clothes would get very dirty. But many kids actually liked it, because it meant no math or Polish lessons. The farm would usually give you a warm meal, like a big pot of soup or sausages cooked over a fire. It felt like a strange kind of field trip, but it was also a reminder that the country was struggling to find enough food for everyone. Even the children had to help put dinner on the table. Treasures in a pencil case. Because things were hard to buy in the 1980s, your school supplies were very precious. Most notebooks had thin yellow paper that felt rough when you wrote on it. You had to be careful not to press too hard, or your pen would poke a hole through the page. The most popular pen was called a Zenith. It was a simple plastic pen, but everyone had one. If you had a fancy pen with 4 different colors of ink, you were the luckiest kid in the class. The most wanted item of all was a Chinese pencil case. These were made of colorful plastic and had a secret magnet that kept them closed. Inside, there were different buttons you could press to make things pop out. One button would open a sharpener, and another would pop up a little tray for your eraser. These were very hard to find in stores. If a relative sent you one from another country, everyone would gather around your desk to see it. You had to guard it carefully, because it was like owning a piece of magic. Pavement champions. During the breaks, the school hallways and playgrounds were full of energy. Since there were no video games or cell phones, kids had to be creative. One of the most popular games was called Capsley. You would take metal bottle caps from soda or beer and fill the inside with wax or plasticine to make them heavy. Then you would decorate them with tiny flags or pictures of famous athletes. You would draw a long winding track on the pavement with chalk and take turns flicking your cap toward the finish line. The girls usually spent their time playing a game with a long elastic band. This was called grabelgum. 2 people would hold the band with their legs, and the third person would jump in and out in a special pattern. As you got better, the band would move higher up from the ankles to the knees, and then to the waist. It was very difficult and required a lot of practice. There was also a game called Baba Jaga. One person would stand with their back to the group and shout the name of the game. Everyone had to run toward them, but stop perfectly still when the person turned around. If you moved even a little bit, you had to go back to the start. The day the schools closed. Everything changed for Polish students on a cold Sunday in December 1981. People woke up to find that the phone lines were cut and there were tanks on the street corners. The government had declared martial law to stop the people from protesting. A man in a dark green uniform appeared on every television screen. He told everyone that they had to stay home. For children, this meant that schools were closed for several weeks. It was a scary time because no one knew what would happen next. When you finally went back to school, the atmosphere was very different. There were soldiers patrolling the streets near the school buildings. You were told not to talk about politics or the groups that were fighting for freedom. Some of your teachers might have disappeared because they were arrested for their beliefs. You had to follow a curfew, which meant you had to be home before it got dark. This period lasted for a long time, and it made the grey school buildings feel even more like a prison. But it also made students and their families stick together and help each other in secret. Polish schools in the 1980s were a place of strict rules, grey colours, and hidden secrets. You learned how to wear a mask for war and how to work in a potato field, but you also learned how to find joy in a game of bottle caps. It was a tough way to grow up, but it made that generation very strong. Even though the schools are much brighter today, the memories of those blue uniforms and the smell of warm milk will never be forgotten by those who were there.